For the past 15 years, I've been talking to DMs, I've been reading their experiences online, I've been looking at their approaches, I've been surveying as many DMs as I can speak to try to understand the best practices for running tabletop role-playing games. Over these years, I've written about my experiences on slyflourish.com, I've written books like Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, and I've continued to have these conversations with hundreds to thousands of DMs, all to better understand the best practices for running tabletop role-playing games. Today, I'm going to offer my top tips for running tabletop role-playing games and D&D in particular. If you'd rather read an article on this topic, I have an article linked in the show notes called Top Tips for Dungeon Masters. That's a companion article to this very video. Now, these tips are definitely opinionated. There are certainly going to be DMs that disagree with some or maybe even all of the tips that are here. But in my experience and the experience of many GMs, these top tips are a wonderful way to bring the most excitement and the most joy to your group when you're running tabletop role-playing games. As always, consider these tips, take the ones that work for you, discard the ones that don't, and build your own system and your own style that works for you and your group. So my first tip is to let the story unfold at the table. A lot of times GMs think that when we're doing our prep, that's when we're building the story of the adventure that we're going to run. We think about the plot, we think about where it's going to go, we think about the directions that it's going to take and where it's going to end. But the most fun we have in our game is when we don't know where the story is going to go and we all experience it together. So instead, during our prep, we focus on having all of the components we need in order to let the story evolve at the table itself. And that's where the story takes place. It takes place when we're sitting with our players, going through a situation and watching where the story happens. Expecting the game to go in a particular direction is one of the most common mistakes that DMs make. We sit down, we write what we've got, and we think this is the way it's going to go. Maybe we saw a story in a movie that we really liked, and we expect the characters to act in the same behavior as the characters in the story. And then they don't, and we're completely lost as to why the players didn't follow the path that our story was supposed to take. So this leads directly to tip 2, which is set up situations and let the characters navigate those situations. So instead of building these detailed plot lines where the characters are supposed to go in only one direction, instead we can look at the situation overall. You can think of it as kind of like a heist movie. There's a location, there's a goal for that location, there are opponents that are going to get in the way of the characters to try to stop them from accomplishing this goal, and there are complications that are going to occur. But we don't focus on exactly what path and what direction the characters are going to take. In fact, during our prep, when we're building situations like this, we want to have a few different ways that the characters might interact with it. Maybe you have a castle that's overtaken by a hobgoblin warlord and all of his minions. And the characters have to go in to steal the secret plans that the hobgoblin warlord has stashed in their office. So in this case, we have a situation, we have a location, we have villains that are in the way, and we have different approaches. Maybe the characters try to sneak their way in pretending to be mercenaries. Maybe they scale the walls using stealth. Maybe they sneak in through secret tunnels down below. We don't exactly know how they're going to approach the situation, but we know that the situation exists, and we've built out the details so that we know how the situation is going to react as the players deal with it. This sort of situational based role-playing games is my favorite kind to run, and I love it particularly because I have no idea where it's going to go, and it's always fun to see what choices the players make and how they approach the situation that we put in front of them. Be on the side of the characters. This sounds kind of obvious in some circumstances, and in other circumstances it goes directly against how DMs typically think of themselves. We are not the adversary of the players. We are not playing a game of us and them. Instead, we are building situations, we are building an environment to showcase the characters. The characters run by the players are the most important characters in the story. They're the focal point of the story. The whole world comes through the lens of the eyes of those characters, and we want to be heroes of those characters. We want to set up situations that make them look cool, and we want to explain things in a way that the players can understand it. Players are only going to understand about half of what we're describing at any given time, but the characters in the story are right there. They're seeing the situation. So if the character would know it, it's up to us to make sure that the player knows it. That means not hitting them with gotchas. If a player is going to accidentally provoke an opportunity attack because we didn't tell them that they happen to be next to an enemy, we should have warned them about that fact instead of just taking the opportunity attack. Give them choices instead of trying to stick them with gotchas. Be fans of the characters. Enjoy what they do. Revel in their victories. Build situations that put hardships on them, but allow them to overcome those hardships. Show them a living world that's around them and a world that they can explore, and put those characters in the focal point of that story. Prepare to improvise. Preparing to improvise seems like an oxymoron. How can you prepare to improvise? But actually you can, and a lot of the ways is thinking about the kind of material that you're preparing and the kind of tools that you're using. Do those tools help you to run a game where you're improvising at the table? An example would be a poster flip mat. If you have one particular poster of one particular location, that is the only place you can use. But if you have a blank poster map and you have the techniques to draw maps quickly, you now have a way to go wherever the characters are going to go. The same way with like monster tokens. Sure, you might have big piles of miniatures that you want to use for specific circumstances, but having a set of generic miniatures or generic tokens that you can use for any situation is a really good tool for improvisation. Instead of defining a series of combat encounters where you've defined everything and how it plays out for each one of 4 or 5 different combat encounters, think about a pool of different monsters that you might use depending on how the situation evolves, and a pool of interesting locations that the characters might run into as they're exploring the area. Secrets and clues is probably the #1 way that I've offered up for how to prepare to improvise. Write down 10 secrets and clues, 10 things the characters might learn in the next session that you're going to run, but don't define where they're going to find those secrets and clues. And that way, during the game, when they're exploring the area, you can drop these secrets and clues wherever they happen to be exploring. It's a great way to let the game go in whatever direction it's going to go, but still have material available to provide to the players when they're playing the game. My next tip is to focus on your next game. It's very easy for GMs and DMs to be thinking about large campaigns, to be thinking about series of adventures or great big storylines that are going to take place, but only one game really matters, and that's the next one you're going to run. That game is real. The game that you're going to be running at your next session, that's going to happen. Those other ones, who can say how they're going to happen? Who can say how the game is going to change? And instead, focus on that next session. Focus on where it starts, focus on what locations the characters might explore, focus on what scenes might take place, what NPCs they might talk to, what monsters they might fight, what secrets and clues they might discover, what treasure they might pick up. Focus on the things that matter for the very next game you're going to run and put most of your attention on there. It doesn't hurt to think maybe 1 or 2 horizons out so you have a general idea where things are going, but don't bother to plan a whole bunch of sessions when you have one session that really matters, and that's the next one you're going to run. My next tip is to build the world from the characters outwards. Instead of building a giant world with detailed histories and an entire huge pantheon, maybe your own planes of existence or giant nations that are fighting one another, instead focus on the material for your campaign world that matters to the characters right now. What deities do the characters need in order to flesh out their characters? What history do the characters need in order to be part of the world that's around them? What are the locations in the general area right around them? You don't have to worry about building locations 5,000 miles away. Focus on the locations that are right around where the characters are today. Start with the characters and build outward from them. Pay attention to pacing. One of the hardest parts about being a good GM is knowing how to control the pacing. How do you move things forward? How do you pull things back? How do you add upward beats? How do you add downward beats? How do you make sure that the pacing of the game is moving not too frantically that the players are feeling overwhelmed, but moving forward enough that the players are always interested in what's happening? There's a lot of little tricks that we can do to maintain pacing. Oscillating between upward and downward beats. Good things happen, then bad things happen. Then good things happen, and then bad things happen. That's a great way to keep people engaged. Something really good happens to the characters. They're very fortunate, and then they're put in a really hard challenge. You don't want to do it 1-to-1 every time, but you want to be generally moving between good things happening and bad things happening as you're running the game in order to keep the interest of that game moving forward. You can also use tricks like lowering monster hit points when a battle has run its course. If you really feel like, hey, this battle has gone as far as it needs to go, and you're looking around the table and you're getting the general feeling that the players are getting kind of bored, drop those monster hit points down so that the next attack kills them. End battles early, but don't tell the players that you're ending the battle early. Don't say something like, well, we're going to call the battle right here. Instead, let them get those last licks in. Let them actually enjoy the end and the conclusion of a battle, instead of either letting it peter on way too long, or instead of cutting it too short by just saying, hey, we're going to end it right here. Keep a timer on hand. Keep a clock. If you know what general schedule you're using for all the scenes in the game that you're going to run, make sure that you're watching the time constantly. Don't just try to rush things at the end of the adventure. Cut from the boring middle. If you've got an adventure that has to fit in a certain amount of time and you have a goal about where you want it to go, be ready to cut boring parts out of the middle. The most boring parts, get rid of those. Get as close to the conclusion as you can with the time that you have. Manage pacing. Keep an eye on pacing, understand the concepts of pacing, and understand how important it is to make that adventure continually moving forward so that your players are always engaged. Focus on the fiction first and the mechanics second. There's a lot of mechanics in our 5e style games. There's a lot of character options. There's a lot of different monsters with different capabilities. There's a whole lot of mechanics that go out there. And it's easy for us to be focusing on those mechanics and forgetting what we're actually talking about, which is the story that's taking place in the world. So I always like to think of this as like a story sandwich. You have the story about what's happening in the game, the mechanics to resolve how it occurs, and then a story that talks about what actually happened in the end. And you can always be thinking about this three-part thing: story, mechanics, story. Story, mechanics, story. When you're talking about the attacks of a monster, describe what that attack looks like, roll the attack, if you need to, roll the damage, and then describe what happened based on the roll. And you can ask the players to do the same thing. Describe what you want to do, then make your action, and then tell us what the result looked like. It's a really great way to apply fiction. And we can extend this out to all of the things that we're looking at in our game. Instead of just deciding that we're going to add mechanical pieces to the game, we can ask ourselves, what's happening in the story of the game? The story is what determines what difficulty class we're using when we're approaching something. Is there a rope? How hard is it to climb the rope? How hard would it be for anybody to climb the rope? So instead of thinking about the scenes and the situations in the game from their mechanical aspects, think about them from the story and build around that story first, and then let the mechanics slide in to tell you how that part of the story is going to be adjudicated as part of the game. My final bonus tip is a pretty straightforward one, and that's always be learning. I am continually learning new things about this hobby. I've been in it for many decades. I've been in it for most of my life, and I'm still learning new things every day. And we have this opportunity. We know about the kind of game that we're running, and we're able to pick up new information and often try those things out in our game with relatively low impact to see if they work. And this is a great way of letting your game evolve. Pick on a particular tip. If you like the tip that you find, try it in your game, see how it works. And these tips are exact examples of that. Throughout these tips, if I picked one or two that you're like, yeah, that's an interesting idea, I want to try that out, try it out in your game and see how it works. But above all, always be learning. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did and you want more tips like this, you can subscribe to the Sly Flourish newsletter. You'll get a weekly RPG-related article sent directly to your inbox, plus a free adventure generator PDF. You can also support me directly on Patreon. Patrons get access to all kinds of tips and tricks like this, video previews, Uncovered Secrets Volume 1 and 2, the City of Arches sourcebook, and a whole lot more. Or you can pick up any of my books, including Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, the Lazy DM's Workbook, and the Lazy DM's Companion, all available in the Sly Flourish bookstore. Links for all of those are in the show notes. Thank you all very much. Have a great day and get out there and play an RPG.